Well, good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled The Evolving Research Landscape, Challenges Faced by Experienced and New-to-Research Sites. My name is Ryan Muse, and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Eligo, who helped develop the content for this presentation. Eligo Health Research accelerates clinical trials through healthcare with access to known patients and their HIPAA-compliant healthcare data, their Intelligo Research Stack technology, and hybrid enrollment model Patient Select. Coupled with the largest known patient access network, Eligo's site solutions enable healthcare practices and research sites to participate in clinical trials. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Katie Eyestone brings an impressive combination of strategic thinking, business planning, and experience in the healthcare space to her role as Vice President of Healthcare Partnerships. She is responsible for continuing the growth of Eligo's network while also working to strengthen relationships with their existing partners. She has served as a consultant to provider organizations and published research on key trends shaping healthcare delivery. And Riley is the VP of Network Expansion at Eligo Health Research. He focuses on expanding and diversifying Eligo's robust network of research partner sites, practices, and healthcare systems. Prior to joining the team, Riley served as Director of Business Development at ClinEdge, leading sales strategy and execution for key business segments as a Director and sponsor of and CRO alliances. He oversaw trial acquisition and placement. Without further ado, though, let's go ahead and hand things over to our first speaker for today. Katie Eyestone, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And on behalf of both Riley and myself, thanks to everyone in the audience today for taking the time to join us. We're pleased to be here with you. Why don't we go ahead and move to the next slide? I'm going to cover just a few slides that give you a little bit more information about Eligo Health Research, the organization that Riley and I represent. Eligo was founded over 6 years ago by individuals with long and distinguished careers in clinical research, and our mission is simple. It's to make it easier for more patients and a greater variety of communities and physicians to participate in clinical research. And we do this with particular values and approaches in mind. One, we build on the trusted relationship between physicians and their patients. Two, we offer innovative trial structures that accelerate how research is conducted, which has tremendous benefit to your organizations as participating research sites working with Eligo. And we do all of this in the interest of bringing more research as care options to, again, communities that don't have access to them today. Let's move to the next slide, please. Eligo has a network of about 400 strong healthcare and research partner organizations. So as I mentioned, we've been around for over 6 years, and in the time have built up quite a strong network with a strong national footprint, and to some degree have an international presence as well as depicted here. If we move to the next slide, you can see the areas of expertise that we operate in. So we work across a wide variety of therapeutic areas within research. We have a business development department with relationships with hundreds of pharmaceutical, medical device, and biotech industry sponsors, and are able to bring a breadth of research opportunities to our healthcare partner organizations. So that's just a little bit more about who Eligo is and who Riley and I represent. Let's get into the meat of the presentation today as advertised. The intent is to cover the following topics, starting first with common site challenges, and then the overall clinical research landscape and how it's evolving, with particular emphasis on trends at the therapeutic area level, as well as with respect to evolving clinical trial models. And we will also, as we delve into these topics, talk about best practices for success for your organization as a participating site, both in terms of how to position for therapeutic expansion, evolutions, as well as decentralized trial preparation. And our intent today is certainly to share this information in a way that is meaningful to you and your organization, whether you have experience conducting research already or are brand new to it and simply considering getting into it. So again, we look forward to working through this material with you and to the Q&A session at the end. Riley, why don't you go ahead and take over and cover the next section?
Thank you so much, Katie. So starting off, we really wanted to focus on some common challenges, right? So as everyone on the webinar knows, there's many challenges that research sites face on a daily basis, but for today's webinar, we really wanted to focus on three that are commonly shared, as Katie mentioned, by both highly experienced research sites as well as those that are new to research. So kind of playing off of that, one of the challenges would be the ebbs and flows in trial volume in a site's core therapeutic area or areas, the tightening of study populations and protocols, and then also the fact that there's multiple trial models being used for industry-sponsored studies. So the real goal of the webinar today is, provide some background, because although this may seem daunting, implementing best practices, having the right strategy in place can largely mitigate these challenges that sites face. So kind of to jump in and provide some overall background on the clinical research landscape, and again, focusing on those challenges that I just had up. The best area to probably start is to talk about trial trends, and more specifically, therapeutic area indication trends we're seeing with study populations and protocol complexity. So clinical trials in and of themselves, you're going to see ebbs and flows of the number of studies that are being conducted at any given time within each therapeutic area, as well as within indications within those therapeutic areas. So there's going to be periods of time that have unusually high trial volume due to a variety of reasons, such as lack of approved therapies, perhaps it's a low standard of care, relatively speaking, or increase in prevalence of the disease state or public awareness of the disease. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, having too many studies in my core areas or indications seems like a good problem. Well, just like there can be flows with a large number of studies, the reverse is also true. So a decrease in the number of studies being conducted in a site's therapeutic area or areas and indications can have impacts, right, including decreases in potential revenue. So this is why we think that it's highly important that sites have an understanding of therapeutic area trends in order to best position themselves for success in this dynamic environment. So the next few slides, I'll be going over some data, with the first one being total industry data of trials by therapeutic area. So this is for last year, so 2021, and as you can see, the top 10 therapeutic areas are going to be oncology, infectious disease, neurology, hematology, respiratory, dermatology, endocrinology, and then this wide range of other, right? So as you can see on the chart, oncology led the way in total trial volume. That's no real surprise. Year in, year out, oncology makes up the largest proportion of total R&D spending, high number of cancers, right? Some of them with relatively low standards of care, lots of R&D incentives that are pushing research this direction. What is interesting is how we see the COVID impact, right? And you can see that by infectious disease being the #2 overall therapeutic area. So that's largely due to your treatments, your vaccines, and then diagnostic development. So again, giving an overview of these high volume therapeutic areas from a total industry standpoint. And then I also want to subsequently frame this with a comparison to what Eligo saw. As Katie mentioned, we have a great business development team that's always working to find the right study opportunities for our sites based upon their therapeutic areas, their focus, their specialties, key things along those lines. So looking through, we see a lot of parity here with the overall industry trend. One thing that I did want to note is you'll see oncology is right around our third top therapeutic area as opposed to first. That is because as a network of sites, oncology has not been our primary focus, although we are gaining capabilities in that area. So I expect this number to continue to increase. So again, just like we saw with this overall industry therapeutic area data on the previous slide, infectious disease was again #1 for the same reasoning. But we also saw over last year that neurology, oncology, as I already mentioned, psychiatry, dermatology, gastroenterology remained relatively high volume areas, which is consistent with pre-COVID data that we have, right? So essentially, COVID took a large slice of the pie in terms of the total number of studies that were conducted last year, meaning fewer studies in other therapeutic areas, although all things equal, their volume remained relatively consistent. So I did want to take this a step further because on a site-by-site level, right, you may be working with a neurologist, but that doesn't mean that you're conducting studies in every single neurological indication. So taking things a step further, what I mean is diving into the actual indication data, and it's going to mirror kind of what I've been saying on these previous slides, right? In 2021, COVID remained a huge chunk of the studies we saw and clinical development in general. But then you can also see things like Alzheimer's disease, right? That's mirroring that volume that we saw in the previous slide in terms of the overall therapeutic area being neurology. And then one thing I did want to mention is that, GI obviously continues to be relatively high volume with indications like NASH and ulcerative colitis leading the charge by study volume. So again, the point of running through these 3 slides with data was kind of to provide educational of what the industry sees overall or saw overall last year in terms of volume studies by therapeutic area, and then provide some more context in terms of what we here at Eligo are seeing based upon these 1,100 plus studies that we brought in for our research partner sites last year. So when we were speaking to common challenges at the beginning of this, one thing that I mentioned was stricter IE criteria and the tightening of study populations. So what do I mean here? So for example, 15, 20 years ago, there was a lot of research in hypertension, right? Led to the development of a number of drugs, and subsequently the standard of care has continued to rise, right? So when we were thinking back to what I mentioned as those R&D incentives, low standard of care, increase in prevalence, no approved therapies, we can kind of think about that along these same lines, right? So as the number of treatments available for hypertension increased, standard of care increases, it leaves a gap for, in this case, resistant hypertension, where standard of care was not as high, there aren't as many drugs available. So where I'm going with this is you'll see a shift from, hey, we're going to be, as an industry, conducting a lot of essential hypertension studies to, oh, we have more of an unmet need in this resistant hypertension, albeit it's a smaller portion of the population. You'll see the same things mirrored, a few examples on the slide. So studies that may have previously been years ago, broad adults ages 50 to 75, there'll be an emphasis on patient diversity, which is a great thing. So, an example would be Asian Americans and African Americans ages 50 to 75. So diabetes, this is always a good one as an example because, years ago, you would get protocols where it would be like, hey, you need to be on 1,000 milligrams of metformin daily and still be uncontrolled to qualify. Now we're seeing protocols where it's, hey, you need to be on metformin plus an oral plus diet and exercise and still have inadequate glycemic control. So gout, whereas it would have been run of the mill, is now focusing on refractory or uncontrolled gout. And another case in point would be fatty liver disease, where we're now seeing, which was echoed in the previous therapeutic area slides that I showed, a focus on NASH for that reason, as well as low standard of care, no approved drugs, things along those lines. So again, the purpose of the slide is just to really illustrate this change that has been seen over the past 15, 20 years of, hey, these broader populations tightening in terms of the focus for specific study protocols. So moving things forward and kind of touching on this last piece of this challenge of the protocol complexity. So again, there's increasing complexity, right? So if we look at it from a technology standpoint, studies will have more vendors than ever for things such as IVRS, eDiaries, EDC. You could go on and on, right? But from a site level, why this can be problematic is because you have multiple companies that you're working with on each and every study that you're conducting. So having your ducks in a row from an operational standpoint is key there. And with this increased protocol complexity, what we have seen is that it may require an increased number of staff per protocol compared with a study in the same population, 5, 10 years ago. So a good example of that may be that for your run-of-the-mill, it's an easy protocol. A coordinator may be able to handle 5 to 7 studies at one time. But when we're talking about these more complex protocols, right, more assessments, more visits, greater technology in terms of the number of vendors contracted, that same coordinator may be only able to handle 3 or 4 studies. And then just to highlight an example of how the study designs are becoming more complex, you're going to see things like procedures like 12 and 24-hour PKs becoming more common. This is kind of an obvious one as to why that is potentially problematic to sites, right? Because it would mean extending hours of business in many cases. So again, this whole section has really served to kind of highlight the research landscape, right? What's going on a therapeutic area and indication basis in terms of new drug development? What are we seeing as general trends in patient populations or target populations for protocols? And then the protocols themselves and what they require at a site level and just how that complexity is increasing. So moving on to trial models, as I mentioned on that initial common challenges slide, one of the challenges that sites are facing is the fact that there's multiple models of trials being conducted every single day. So to kind of give a little bit more background on that, especially for our new to research members of the audience, I kind of broke this down into 4 categories. So traditional trials, right? Those are what we all think of. Clinical trials that are conducted in person. Patients come to the research site for study visits. They're interacting face-to-face with the investigator and site staff. And then we have this very broad category of decentralized trials, which hybrid and Sightless or virtual trials both fall under. But again, this is a very broad definition. In general, DCTs are executed through telemedicine, mobile health, and also using a wide variety of technologies. But again, this is an extremely broad definition. So it's a little bit easier to break it down into subcategories, right? So the first being hybrid. So you can really think of a hybrid study as a mix between a sightless or virtual study and a traditional study, right? Some activities are conducted remotely using technologies, while others take place in person at traditional study sites, right? And then this final category that's worth touching on is the sightless or virtual trials, right? So what is a sightless or virtual trial? It's one where there's no traditional study sites, so physical locations. There's no in-person interaction with patients on site, and the study is conducted almost completely through technology and or home health visits. So again, because I really feel that this is foundational for the rest of the webinar, Traditional model, think in person, at site, patients are meeting and interacting with their physician, their investigator, and the other study staff. And then we have this broad category of decentralized trials, which encompasses hybrid. So some activities are conducted on site, some are conducted remotely via technology and/or home health, and then sightless, right, where there's no on-site visits, no in-person interactions. So I wanted to provide a little bit more detail here on each one of the trial models that we've discussed, and talk about some advantages and limitations to each. So traditional studies, again, are always going to include in-person visits. Patients are coming to the research site, they're having that face-to-face interaction with the investigator and other study staff. So some advantages to traditional trials are that patients have the ability to participate in trials with a physician that they know and trust, and increased oversight of all activities by the investigator and study staff. So some limitations to traditional trials are there is a patient burden associated with being in a study, right? So you have to travel to and from the site for study visits, which in some cases, especially if you're doing a phase 2 and they're kind of packed in there, it could be a lot of visits over a relatively short period of time, right? There's implications. There's implications to that from a, hey, I had to miss work today or part of work, right? Things that essentially when I'm saying patient burden, they're things that patients are having to deal with, and they might be limiting factors in a patient's potential participation in a trial. And then another limitation is that oftentimes, or I should say predominantly, patient health information in relation to that study is collected during on-site visits. So keep this in mind as we move towards decentralized trials and kind of go over, the same format, right, for sightless and hybrid trials. So again, for sightless or virtual trials, there's no traditional sites, no in-person interaction, study activities conducted through technologies or home health visits with the patients. So there are some advantages to this model, just like I had been talking about on the traditional trial side, right? There's patient burden associated with participating in clinical trials. There's a time commitment, travel commitment, things along those lines. Some advantages to sightless or virtual trials are that it's more convenient for patients to participate, which can lead to increased and more diverse patient participation if you look at it on an overall trial basis. And then there's also the ability, as we've been talking about, these technological and home health components to the studies to monitor patients' health on a more real-time basis. So that being said, there are some pretty big limitations to sightless trials, right? In general, they may not be suitable for many interventional trials, especially those where IP is administered, via IA injection or infusion, and they may not be suitable for severe diseases where patients require a higher level of care. So on the hybrid trial side, again, hybrid meaning that some study activities are conducted remotely using technologies or home health, while other study activities take place in person on a site, just like a traditional trial. It has advantages that are similar to those of a virtual trial in terms of participation, right? So a little bit less burden than a traditional trial because, again, some of those are home-based or remote assessments that patients are taking part in. But another advantage that a sightless trial does not have is patients do have the ability to have interactions with their trusted physician because, again, some of the visits are taking place on site. So on the flip side of that, in talking about some of the limitations, you will see some disadvantages to this model if it is a very procedure-heavy study, but what I think is actually an advantage here is the fact that, okay, let's say you do have a pretty interventional, way that IP is being administered, such as infusion, right? You can do that treatment visit on site and then a follow-up visit virtually. So it's kind of hybrid trials for a lot of scenarios tend to be the best of both worlds, right? And mixing those great elements to traditional trials with those great elements, especially in terms of patient burden for sightless or virtual trials. And that kind of leads us into more and more trials are going to the sightless hybrid decentralized model. So recent market analysis estimates, up to a 14, almost 15% growth rate in DCT studies in the coming years. So now that we've kind of given a thorough background on not only what these challenges are, but kind of showing some real world examples of things, we thought it would be prudent to have a takeaway for you. And that's why we're talking about best practices for site success. So the area that I wanted to start with is therapeutic expansion. So if you remember back to that common challenges slide, one of the first things I said was ebbs and flows of trial volume within therapeutic areas and indications. So what therapeutic expansion means is, let's say, I'll give an example to illustrate. So let's say that you're a site and you focus on psychiatry, right? Naturally, there's a little bit of crossover between psychiatry and neurology. So you decide, hey, I want to break into neurology. So now you're conducting research in 2 therapeutic areas. So just the act of expanding from the therapeutic areas you're currently covering and adding new ones. And why I think this is important and worth mentioning from a best practice standpoint is that therapeutic expansion offers you as a site protection in the event of slowdown in your old primary areas, right? So you essentially can work to keep your overall study volume the same. There just may be a shift into this new area that you've broken into. And then a huge benefit of therapeutic expansion from a site perspective is it can lead to enhanced sponsor and CRO relationships, right? An increasing number of sponsors and CROs want to partner with sites that can contribute to projects across multiple therapeutic areas. There's a ton of reasons for that, but it essentially boils down to efficiency, right? And sites can also see that efficiency through things such as master agreements, dedicated points of contact at that partner CRO or sponsor, and then also early access to studies. So again, and we'll speak more to this throughout the section, therapeutic expansion, the main takeaways is one of the reasons to do this is it offers you protection in the event that one of your primary areas experiences a slowdown in the total number of studies being conducted, and then it also allows you to enhance your relationship with sponsors and CROs. So getting into the practicality of this, right? If I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, I know that we need to at least be considering expanding into a new therapeutic area. What factors should I take into account in deciding what therapeutic area is right for my site to break into? So projected trial volume. And what you want to be thinking there is, okay, what factors are incentivizing R&D spending? So taking it way back to those therapeutic area charts that we showed earlier, right? If possible, you likely want to expand into a therapeutic area that is projected to have large trial volume over the next 3, 4, 5 years, right? If you're really looking to maximize the benefit. Another key consideration is your current sponsor relationships, right? So if there's sponsors that you're working with and they have, and you're working with them again in psychiatry, we'll continue using that example, and you notice a commonality, right? Hey, we're working with 10 sponsors right now, and 7 of them are also doing work in neurology. That can help direct your decision-making there, right? Because we all know it's going to be easier to break into a new therapeutic area with a sponsor that you've already worked with before. And then a key thing, is operational considerations, right? Is my site currently situated to take on new research in a therapeutic area? And then to dig a little bit more into that, right? So from an operational consideration standpoint, so think about staff, right? And we'll start with investigators. Hey, do I need to bring on a neurologist to successfully conduct studies in this new therapeutic area, right? Are we set up to accommodate specialized procedures? Or will I need to partner with new facilities for them? And then scales and assessments, right? This is key for so many therapeutic areas when we're looking at study outcomes, right? But does my current staff have experience with common scales and assessments associated with that target therapeutic area or target indication that you're working to break into? So this has been pretty high level, so I thought it would be useful to show some more granular examples of, hey, I'm going to break into neurology, or I'm thinking about breaking into neurology, or I think I'm about breaking into dermatology. So we'll start with dermatology. So from a consideration standpoint, right, we know that on whole, dermatologists are almost always involved in these studies as a PI or a sub-I, but at the same time, you do see crossover with therapeutic areas such as allergy and immunology. So sometimes those investigator specialties will be acceptable to the sponsor or CRO in place of a dermatologist, right? And then to touch on the scales and assessments, so appropriate training expertise with assessments such as, global investigator assessment, your ESA. So that's the eczema severity or area and severity index and SCORAD. And then to flip it to neurology, so for neurology, right, again, neurologists are almost always going to be involved in at least a sub-I capacity. And because a lot of neurology focuses on relatively, debilitating conditions, it would be ideal if you are onboarding a new investigator that they have an active practice and or your site has a strong trusted referral relationship or referral network, right, with local practices, hospitals, things along those lines. Familiarity in scales, I mean, ADAS-Cog, you can see them all listed up here, but MMSE, right, especially if you're thinking for Alzheimer's disease, dementia, things along those lines. And then in terms of study procedures, right, imaging capabilities, this is a big one, MRI, PET, CT, pharmacy setup. I know I touched on this earlier, but we see a lot of infusion-based delivery of IP, especially in neurology. And then you have things like lumbar punctures that are common procedures. So not just being well versed in them, but the ability to explain, the lumbar puncture, why it's happening from a study perspective to those patients. So again, hopefully this slide has kind of taken the last few that we've looked at and provided some granular detail to the types of operational considerations that sites should be looking at as they're choosing which therapeutic area to break into. So I think to continue a little bit further down on this therapeutic expansion category, let's say you've onboarded a new neurologist, we'll keep the example consistent, are really looking to break into a new therapeutic area. This site identification, so the process of applying for studies in your new therapeutic area is really going to be a key focus for you to make sure that, hey, I did all of this work from, staff, operational, vendor standpoint in order to be able to conduct studies in a new therapeutic area. I want to make sure I give myself the best shot in landing them. So one key point is that site selection is generally an incredibly competitive process. So if we look at industry standards, if a study ultimately needs 100 sites, they're often going to have to reach out to 200 to 300 sites in order to whittle it down to the 100 that are the best fit. So feasibility questionnaires, this is the key inflection point in the site identification process. It's where you go from the most number of sites interested to the fewest moving forward with next steps. But as background, feasibility questionnaires provide sites with an opportunity to showcase fit for study inclusion, and study teams conversely, study teams on the sponsor or CRO side use FQs to gauge a site's potential suitability for a trial. So just like I said, a good feasibility could be the difference between getting a study and not getting a study. So to get into this in a little bit more detail in terms of best practices, which are important no matter what study you're applying for, but especially so when you're working to break into a new therapeutic area, a number of mistakes that I've commonly seen that lead to, hey, we don't want to move forward would be simple ones like leaving questions blank. But on top of that, not providing enough detail, right? If you have space to write 3 sentences on a particular question, you write 2 words, it really doesn't convey interest. You're not selling yourself to that sponsor of why am I the best fit site for your study. Being too conservative in key numbers. So oftentimes I see this, it's especially true when you're looking at a feasibility questionnaire and then it's saying, how many patients do you have access to based upon the IE criteria. So oftentimes I'll see sites that will just go into their CTMS and do a query there. But in reality, the site has a well-established referral relationship with several local practices that are also going to refer patients over for the study, right? And they may not be taking into account those referral relationships when providing feedback to that question, which translates to, right, a smaller number than the reality is. And if it doesn't appear that you have the enough of the right patients to contribute to the study from an enrollment expectation standpoint, it's going to be hard to convince the sponsor that you are a good fit, right? And then overall, failing to highlight key selling points. One thing, and you'll see it on the right-hand side of the slide, is the comment section, right? Generally, feasibility questionnaires, at the end of them, one of the last questions will be like, please feel free to provide any additional information that you didn't have a chance to throughout the other portions of this questionnaire. Use this to your advantage, right? You need to re-emphasize your site's interest, including any key selling points, patient access, and then another thing that I didn't touch on, but is worth mentioning, is you have a new investigator that doesn't have research experience in this indication. Play up any site level experience. Let's say one of your coordinators has done 8 Alzheimer's disease studies in a previous job. Worth mentioning, without a doubt. So with that being said, I'm gonna actually flip it back over to Katie for best practices, and more specifically on the being prepared to conduct hybrid and decentralized trials.
Thanks, Riley. That was a lot of great information and practical information that you just walked us through. Appreciate it. So I'm going to continue then with the topic of best practices to position your organization for success in an environment where the types of trials that are being conducted are evolving in clinical research. So how does your organization best position given that change and shift that's occurring? To recap what Riley described earlier, when we're talking about the emergence of decentralized trials, keep in mind that there isn't a universally agreed upon definition of what we mean by a decentralized trial. So we tend to think of it as an umbrella term that incorporates trials in which there's some component of the protocol that's being delivered in some way, shape, or form, not at a site. So it could be remotely, virtually, some element of non-site-based trial delivery. And as Riley mentioned, under this umbrella term of decentralized, there's a range from purely sightless trials where the patient involved in the trial never visits a site as part of that conduct of the trial, to more of a hybrid approach where there's a mix of site-based visits over the course of the trial, as well as aspects of the trial that are delivered remotely or virtually. The reason for this shift and the reason that market research is indicating that we could see a 15% increase in these decentralized trials over the next few years is largely based on shifts that are occurring in healthcare delivery and a push to make healthcare delivery more patient-centric and convenient. So just as many of you may have experienced the option to meet with your physician over video, so too is there a shift and a reconsideration in how do we make clinical trial delivery as convenient as possible for the patient who's participating. So given all that, what are some tips for your organization to position in this evolving trial landscape? As noted here on the slide, one of the things that we believe is really important for your site to be successful is to be purposeful about gaining experience in participating in some version of decentralized trials going forward, and to look for those opportunities to do so. The reason is that will be attractive to sponsoring organizations as they're selecting sites for studies and as they too move in the direction of offering more decentralized trial structures. Keep in mind that there are certain capabilities that your organization will need to develop to be successful in these more decentralized trial structures. For example, new workflows to account for a mix of visits that may be conducted on site and then virtually or remotely, or other elements of the protocol that are accomplished through remote monitoring. it's likely that you'll be coordinating with new players throughout the course of a decentralized trial, such as a home health agency or other sorts of vendors who are put into place to establish this sort of increased flexibility and patient centricity in these decentralized trials. And you should prepare for the need for more reminders to make sure that patient-reported outcomes, or PROs, are being completed. So again, to the degree that aspects of the protocol are being delivered virtually, there's more onus in some respects on the patient to make sure they're getting in the documentation required as part of the protocol, and on your site to make sure that the patient is taking those necessary steps. So these are examples of the kinds of capabilities that would be required of your organization, typically in a hybrid decentralized trial, and why we think it's important for your organization to begin to develop some of this experience. We thought it might be helpful to offer a specific path that could provide your organization the opportunity to participate in hybrid trials and to begin to develop some of these capabilities and experience. And I wanted to feature, if we could go to the next slide, please, an innovative trial structure that Eligo has developed called our Patient Select Trial. This is a hybrid model structure. We are making this model structure available across a wide variety of therapeutic areas. And essentially, where possible, where we find that the protocol allows, we are architecting trials to incorporate aspects of virtual visits combined with site-based visits, again, in an effort to increase the patient centricity and convenience throughout the course of the trial. So I have a few slides to walk through that will bring this patient select model to life. At a high level, one of the key defining features of the patient select trial is that Eligo runs a central coordinating office where we coordinate as many of the operational and administrative workflows across the course of the trial as possible, and thereby minimizing and reducing as much as possible the operational and other burdens and responsibilities at your organization as a participating site on the trial. We do look for those opportunities to deliver aspects of the trial virtually or remotely or through home health in an effort to make the trial as patient-centric as we can, which of course improves the chances of patient engagement and commitment to participate in the trial. And we structure our trials to incorporate a very innovative, designed for research technology platform. Again, this is to ease communication between our organizations throughout the conduct of the trial and to make it as easy as possible for patients to engage in the trial and remain engaged in the trial from beginning to end. So we'll talk in a little bit more detail about what that looks like. We could move to the next slide, please. Now, your organization participating in a patient select trial, of course, is a way to begin to develop the kinds of capabilities that I mentioned were so important to position in this evolving landscape. And in addition, we can offer other benefits to your organization in this patient select trial structure. One is the ability to curate a pipeline for your organization. So when we work together on these trials, we gather information about your patient population. We leverage de-identified data about your patient population to try to match up trial opportunities with the needs and characteristics of your patient population, so that we're only bringing you trial opportunities in this patient select format that appear to be a really good fit for your patients and for your site's interests and capabilities. I mentioned a moment ago that the Eligo Central Coordinating Office on a patient select trial manages as much operationally and from a regulatory perspective as possible on a trial, as you can see depicted here in the middle of the slide. We also, and I'll get into this more in just a minute, play a very active role in supporting your organization in terms of patient identification, recruitment, screening, and even outreach if you would like us to. And we take a lead role in providing extensive training specific to the protocol of your site and your investigators. All of this is done in a way that keeps your patients at your site. Again, these are hybrid trials, and our intent is to build on the trusted relationship that you have with your patients. Why don't we move to the next slide to further bring this model to life? So the central coordinating office that I mentioned is run by Eligo, is led by Eligo's medical director. So our physician medical director serving as the overall coordinating investigator on the patient select trial. The coordinating office that the medical director runs is doing all of the things I've mentioned on the previous slides, as well as arranging for any vendors, any home health agents, any sorts of remote monitoring or remote services that are going to be architected into the trial delivery for the patient select study. So all of these things are managed centrally, again, with an aim to make it as easy as possible for your site to participate on the study, focusing on those activities that are going to be delivered at the site without the extra operational burden or regulatory burden that typically comes with conducting a trial. If we could move to the next slide, please. A very significant capability that Eligo offers to sites in the patient select model, as I mentioned briefly just a moment ago, is our end-to-end capabilities to assist with patient recruitment and screening. So those of you who have experience in clinical research know that finding the patients for a trial is often the period of trial preparation where things can really slow down and trial timelines get extended and trials get delayed. Eligo offers the possibility of conducting de-identified patient queries to conduct initial feasibility on these studies on behalf of your organization. We have a team of experts who can conduct chart review of potential patients for the study on your behalf, working with your investigator to determine who appear to be the best patients to solicit for participation in the study. And if you'd like, we have capabilities to reach out to patients and see whether they're interested in participating in the study. All of these services are customized based on your preferences. And like all of our services in the patient select model, they're at no charge to your organization. Let's move to the next slide, please. I wanted to just briefly give you an example of what it looks like when we contract with a site on a patient select trial. Obviously, this is a unique and innovative way to structure a hybrid decentralized trial. And we want to be very transparent about which organization involved in the trial is responsible for what aspect of the protocol. So all of that is detailed out between our organizations, as is the reimbursement to your organization for those activities for which the site is responsible. So the detailed list of responsibilities as well as the budget are all shared in a very transparent way. And you're never paying Eligo, I want to emphasize that again, for any services. We're paying you for your participation and your role in the study. And in a patient select trial, there are opportunities both for reimbursement for your startup time preparing for the trial, as well as the activities conducted throughout the course of the trial. Lastly, if we could go to the last slide, I wanted to emphasize again that by participating with Eligo on our innovative hybrid model, your organization has the opportunity to stand out from the rest in terms of gaining experience with decentralized trials and building some of the capabilities that sponsors will take note of. And in addition, on top of that, these patient select trials offer the opportunity to expand your research pipeline, to accelerate how research is conducted, which only increases your capacity to take on more trials and to complete them more quickly. There's an enhanced productivity element for your site because Eligo's central office is taking on so many of the operational and regulatory responsibilities centrally. And all of this is done building upon your relationship with your patients and in an interest of keeping your patients at your site. Combined, it creates a great opportunity for your organization to increase your revenue from research. So with that overview and those suggestions about one pathway for you to gain experience with decentralized hybrid trials, we'd like to, again, thank you for your time and open it up for Q&A. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. I would like to invite our audience to continue sending their questions or comments right now using the questions window for this Q&A portion of the webinar. I've already received some questions though, so we'll get ourselves started with those. The very first question that I have for you here would like to know, what are the most important operational elements to consider when determining if we could try research in a new therapeutic area?
Yeah, and Katie, I can take that one. So again, this kind of goes into the information that we touched on during the presentation. So from an operational standpoint, well, I'll start with a strategy standpoint, right? You're most likely going to want to expand into a therapeutic area that has a high volume of anticipated studies over the next 5 years. And then as you narrow this down from an operational standpoint, you're going to want to look at factors like, am I going to require onboarding of a specialist, right? For an investigator, in order to be able to conduct studies in those therapeutic areas, do I have the expertise and the relevant rating scales, things like that, as well as do I have the ability to conduct all of the study assessments on site, or may I have to go out and form new vendor collaborations for things like imaging or infusion?
It's very good. Thank you very much. Next, we have someone wondering, how widespread do you see sightless trials becoming over a 5-year timeline?
So I can touch on that one as well, and then Katie, jump in with anything you'd like to add. So it's obvious that we're going to see an increase in, I'll say, decentralized or hybrid trials in general, including sightless trials. However, I personally believe that sightless trials, there's some limitations surrounding them, right? Again, for things, or for, I'll say, diseases that require more intensive care from a physician and support staff, being completely remote is obviously going to be a limiting factor. For studies where IP is administered via, again, infusion, I'll keep touching on that, as well as things like ultrasound guided intra-articular injections, those obviously have to be done on site by medical professionals. So those are kind of rate limiting factors. So while I do think there will be a continued increase in sightless, virtual, hybrid, decentralized trials, there are naturally rate limiting factors, right, that I mentioned.
Very good, thank you. The next question I have asks, what eClinical vendors do you partner with for eSource, EDC, eCOA, ePro, etc.?
So we generally use a proprietary platform that we have developed specifically to conduct research in partnership with our healthcare and research partner organizations. That platform is called Eligo, and it serves as the technology platform for many of the things that were just mentioned in the question. We also recently acquired a technology called Root technology, which is a mobile way of engaging patients throughout the course of a trial and keeping them engaged in a trial. So those are a couple examples of the technology that we use. The third I would mention is a data platform called Research Connect. And when I was speaking earlier about our ability to conduct de-identified patient queries on your behalf as one of the ways that we accelerate trials, it's through establishing Research Connect connectivity to whatever your source is for patient data, whether that's an EHR or some sort of patient registry that you maintain. So through that Research Connect connectivity, which is only for research purposes, we are able to accelerate trials. So that's another example of a technology that we're using. Riley, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything.
No, I think you covered it.
That was a very in-depth answer. Thank you very much. We have another question that's come in that would like to know, when applying for our first study in a new therapeutic area, how do we use the feasibility questionnaire to put our site in the best position to be awarded?
No, that's a great question. And that's commonly a hump, so to speak, that sites need to overcome, right? Because you've done all of the work. We've onboarded a new investigator in the specialty that we're breaking into. We've done all of these operational things, and now we need to get a study. So my suggestion is you really need to play up. Well, one would be trying to work with sponsors in this new therapeutic area that you're already working with in your core therapeutic area is going to be one of the easier ways to break in, right? So leveraging that existing relationship. And then when speaking more specifically about applying to the study via the feasibility questionnaire, you really want to make sure that you dot your T's and or you cross your T's and dot your I's. With the reason being, again, if you're leaving questions blank, if you're providing 2 words of context when you could provide a paragraph of context, and you're not really focusing on, hey, although I don't have clinical research experience in this particular population, we have a ton of clinical experience, or my coordinators do, although the investigator does not, you're really selling yourself short. So the more work you put into the feasibility questionnaire overall, the more interest it conveys, the more compelling it is to that sponsor and CRO of why you are a good site for our study.
That's great. Thank you. Very informative. Next, I have someone who's curious if there are certain indications or therapeutic areas that you believe the volume of decentralized or hybrid trials will continue to grow.
No, and that's another great question. So again, I would look at this as more what is a rate limiting factor from a virtual trial standpoint, kind of going back to the first question that you had asked. So studies in populations where it's a pretty severe or debilitating disease that require a higher level of care, those are perhaps candidates for a hybrid trial at most, but fully virtual, I don't see that. So to get to the heart of your question, it's going to be those easier, simpler indications, right? So a good example might be, I think the first fully virtual study conducted was in acne. And why I'm illustrating that as an example is because when you look at the primary endpoints of the study, a lot of them are based upon things such as lesion count or reduction in lesion size, which could be simply taken via photograph, right? And the central investigator could from there grade it, so to speak. So it's more of your easier indications that are prime candidates for sightless trials than those more complex, medical diseases, disabilities.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that answer, for all of the answers. However, we have reached the end of the Q&A portion of our webinar today. Now, if we couldn't attend to your questions, though, the team at Eligo may follow up with you, or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses that are up on your screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I'm also sending you a link in the chat box, and with this link, you'll be able to view the recording of this event on this page, and you can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join me once more in thanking our speakers for their time here today. We hope you all found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.